So at this point, honestly, we've covered most of HTML. There's some details we haven't covered. There's some elements we haven't covered that are used occasionally. But for the most part, you've gotten a pretty good introduction. That's most of what HTML will use. It's not very complicated. It's pretty simple. It's really just elements and kind of knowing what elements to use when. And once we dig into CSS, you can do all kinds of stuff with CSS where, you could just use divs for everything in your HTML, and you can use the CSS to make it look however you want. But our HTML is still pretty important to get right because, screen readers get a lot of information from our HTML as far as what the context of our content is. It's also just good to format our content well. We want things to be formatted correctly, structured well. But pretty simple. So again, if you have questions, if you need help, there's all kinds of online resources to find. If you're trying to figure out what type of element to use for certain content, just Google it. You'll find all kinds of stuff. Look at the HTML specification, or find resources that kind of walk you through different options. So CSS is HTML is our content and our structure. CSS is the style information. So again, your HTML files so far have been kind of boring looking. They're very basic web pages. CSS is how we do all the styling. So the color, size, position on the page, etc. CSS is all that's required to make your plain boring HTML pages look like every other web page you've seen. Every web page on the internet uses CSS. May use some combination of CSS and images. There's Flash or a few fancy things that can be used as well. But for the most part, CSS, the coolest website you've ever seen uses CSS that makes it cool. So it's really, really powerful. A website I really like to kind of demonstrate is csszengarden.com. So what they've done is they've created like a base HTML file that you can download. And if we look at the source, we'll see it. So really simple HTML file. Nothing you guys have not seen already. Again, you can look at any HTML file on the internet, and you guys are going to be familiar with all the elements used at this point. So there's a few fancy things in here, but for the most part, pretty simple. They've got their body, they've got a div, they're using section and header. They've got they use this role attribute, which has to do with screen readers. But we won't really talk about that too much. They've got paragraphs with text. So this is like the CSS in Garden HTML file. And then anyone can write your CSS to style it however you'd like, and you can submit that, and then they'll link to your CSS file and to kind of show off the different kinds of things you can do with CSS. So this is like the default design. So, pretty simple, pretty basic. Over here on the right, you can see some of the other designs. So if you just click on these, this file uses the same exact HTML, but with their CSS, they've completely changed the look and feel of the page. And obviously, they're using some images, like they've added these images. These might even be pure CSS drawings or like SVG files or something. So it's a H2. Looking here. Yeah, that's on the head. Okay, so it's a background image. So they've got, this is the background image that they've applied via CSS to that. So again, they're adding images in, but the layout, the colors, everything, pure CSS. So again, they haven't modified the HTML at all for this page. All they've done is written CSS and applied a CSS file to it. A very different look and feel. Go to this one. Again, very, very different look, entirely different layout. The structure seems very different. Same exact HTML, just a different CSS file. That's one's bio page. One more. Robot named Jimmy. So again, this one's even got animation. All CSS. It may be an animated GIF. You can actually do animation with CSS. Might be able to tell which one they're doing. Inspect it. Yeah, it looks like they've got an actual image. So they've got like a GIF that's the background image there that has that animation. So again, CSS is hugely powerful. There's all kinds of stuff you can do with it. Between just your HTML and your CSS, that's really all that you need to do any kind of web design. So like HTML, CSS is a specification. It's maintained by the World Wide Web Consortium. It first released in 1996. CSS 3 is kind of the equivalent of HTML5, more or less. It's kind of the current version. It's still being developed a little bit. They're still adding features, but for the most part, it's pretty widely supported at this point. So it's pretty safe to use. We see CSS 3 features. Stuff like animation is new in CSS 3. Typically, it's pretty safe to use. One thing to note, though, is CSS, like HTML, CSS can be interpreted differently in different browsers. And again, you know, it's a specification. There's some of the specifications are a little bit loose. It can be up to the browsers on how to interpret that, how to render it, what to make it look like. So especially when you're working on like complex layouts or anything really fancy, you're going to want to test it in different browsers and make sure it looks consistent in those browsers. So like browsershots.org is kind of nice. It just will take a screenshot of your page in a bunch of different browsers and show it to you. It's free also, which is nice. Cross-browser-testing.com is a paid service, but it lets you actually load your website in different browsers on the internet and kind of interact with them and scroll them. So it's really nice if you're testing JavaScript, stuff like that. There's also, I can't remember what the website is, but Microsoft provides Windows virtual machines for browser testing. So you can say like I want like Windows 7 IE 10, and it'll give you a virtual image, virtual machine file you can run on your computer in VirtualBox or something and test it there. So that's kind of a nice feature as well, because I don't have IE on this computer. Yeah, question.
So what is the testing in different browsers and this like problem? How do you deal with this?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's different ways. One thing, this is kind of getting, you know, even beyond what we'll talk about in class, but there's browser prefixes on some CSS rules. So sometimes you'll say, you know, Mozilla, this is the value, i.e. this is the value, something like that. You can use media queries to adjust, you know, based on different things. There's some JavaScript stuff you can do. There's what we call like shims that will load like a library that kind of translates your CSS3 to CSS2, stuff like that. So yeah, there's no one answer. It's, you have to figure it out. So great question. It's not fun when that happens. You know, like it means something's weird, and you have to sometimes just trying it a different way will help. Sometimes you have to research and find out why that browser does it differently. Figure out from there. Good question though. Okay, so including CSS in our web page. So the first way, which is not a good way, is using the style attributes. You can put the style attribute on any element, and then give it your CSS rule, color red or whatever. That will change the color of that element. However, it's being phased out of HTML5. Most browsers still support it because a lot of websites use that. A lot of old websites were built entirely using that. But it's not something we want to be using this day and age. It also makes changing your styles very difficult because you have to go back and find every single place where you set that style. It's not a good way of doing things. It's also linking our style and our content a lot. We want to keep our content and our structure and our style pretty separate, just as a rule. So again, don't do it this way. A little bit better way to do it, but still not the way we'll do it in class, is to use a style tag. You may have done this as well. So style, and you type CSS, text/CSS, can put your CSS stuff and then close your style tag. It will go in the head of your HTML. The downsides here, one, it doesn't allow you to reuse that CSS on multiple pages. So if you've got a web page that's multiple pages long, you'd have to copy and paste that section into each page. And then if you change it, you're going to have to go change it on every page that you have that CSS. It gets really messy, really hard to deal with on multiple pages. It also clutters up your HTML file. That CSS can get really long. So if you want to edit something in your HTML, you're going to have to scroll past all that CSS to get to it. And again, it's still kind of mixing our content and our style. They're at least separated, but they're still in the same file. It's not as good of a route. The best way is to use a link tag to include an external CSS file. So we use the href attributes. Here's an example. We do link href with style.css. This type is always text/CSS, and rel is always style sheet. Talk about that more in just a second. So this lets us reuse the same style sheet on multiple pages. So, you know, on the website I work on, even it's PHP generated. So there's, you know, an infinite amount of pages based on, you know, what requests come in. But I always include that style sheet, and that lets me reference that same style sheet on every page, even if it's dynamically generated. It also lets us to edit everything in one place. You can even break it out to multiple files. We'll do that sometimes. You know, have like a, you know, main.css and like a subpages.css or something. You can kind of get creative, but it lets you kind of keep all your styles centralized into one file. A couple times I'll go back to a website I made several years ago and say, okay, I want to, you know, kind of change the look of this website, or the client wants it to be updated. I don't have to touch my HTML at all. I'll just create a new CSS file, CSS2 or style2.css, and rewrite the CSS. And then all I have to do is change this one line in my HTML to point to the new CSS file, and the style is completely changed. So really the better way to do it. So again, that link tag, href, is the path to the CSS file. It can be relative, which it probably will be in this class. We're loading a file within our, you know, site files. It can also be absolute. So we'll use this a lot for like pulling in external CSS libraries. So stuff like Bootstrap or other frameworks. We might use their version of the file and load from their domain. Usually it's loading it from what we call a content delivery network, which is just means that it'll pull it from the server closest to you, and they should have it on lots of different servers, so it's always available. The downside here is sometimes those CDNs do go down. We've run into this at work. We were loading Bootstrap on from their external, you know, page, and Bootstrap had a problem and it was unavailable. Our site broke while that was unavailable, so we changed it. We downloaded that file and included it locally. So there's some benefits. If you're just building something for testing, if you're, you know, building an app, the quickest way to do it is just to pull in the CDN. Totally fine. It's also easy to update. You can just change the version number in the URL usually. It's nice for some uses, but once you get into a stable production environment, you want to pull it down to a local file. So type, again, always text/CSS, and rel will always be style sheet. There's some other uses of link. There's a link down here that kind of goes through those, but it's not used as commonly anymore. And again, you can have multiple link tags to import multiple CSS files as well. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. Okay, so CSS rules. So the CSS rules target HTML elements and applies a group of styles. So there's two parts to our rules. First is the selector. The selector indicates which elements the style applies to. So if we're changing the font size, the selector says these are the elements that I want to change that style on. We can target multiple elements by separating them with commas. And again, we'll go over this in a minute, what these selectors look like. There's several different types. So after the selector that tells us which elements to do, we have the declarations, which indicates how the targeted element should be styled. So the declarations are the actual styles that we're applying. They're contained inside curly brackets after the selector. And then we have multiple declarations separated by semicolons and typically a new line as well. These declarations have two parts. There's the property, which is the aspect of the element you want to change, like the color or the font size. And then we have the value, which is the actual setting for that property. So red, if that's our color. So here's an example of a CSS rule. So again, this whole thing is the rule. The first part here is the selector. So in our case, we're targeting paragraphs. So we'll talk about, those in a minute. Then we've got the curly brackets containing the declarations. Here we've just got one declaration, font size, property, and 12 pixels is the value. Make sense? Questions? We'll go over a lot more examples. Here's another example of selecting multiple elements. So we're selecting all of our H1s and our H2s and our H3s using those commas. This is typically how we want to format our CSS. Use the curly brackets and space them out. And then we put our rules or declarations indented in just to kind of make it clear that they go inside of that selector. And here we've got multiple declarations. So we set the font family to Arial. We've got a semicolon at the end, and then we do color in yellow. So that's how we have, and we can have as many, of those declarations as we want. Okay, so different types of selectors. There's quite a few types of selectors. The first one that we should rarely use, but I want you to at least be familiar with it, is called the universal selector. So you can just do star, and that will select all of the elements on our page. Very rarely do we actually need to use that. There's a few cases where it makes sense, but typically we want to avoid it. It's very slow because the browser has to loop through every single element on your page and apply whatever style. So that's kind of, it takes up render time. And it's just, there's rarely justified uses of, styling something to every single element on our page. Occasionally it makes sense, but probably in this class we'll never use it. It's also a type selector. So this is probably the most common. We match elements by their name. So for example, we can match paragraph elements by just P. So any HTML element can be targeted this way, including like the body tag or inputs or, table rows, whatever. So here we've got like headings. We can target, our different heading levels. We can target list items. We can target A's. Any type of element we can target by that name. And it'll target all of those elements. Yeah, question. Yeah, we'll talk about that as we go. So if it's the background color of the whole page, then yeah, body is a very valid way to do it. Great question. So then after the type selector, we've got a class selector. So we can use this to match elements by their class. So we talked about how we add class to elements. This is where that becomes useful. We use a period. So we do like .note. We'll target any elements with class of note. We can also combine these selectors. So we can combine the type and the class selector and say any paragraphs with class note. So you don't do any spaces, you just do your type selector and then your dot and then your class name. We can also combine multiple class selectors as well. So we can do like paragraph dot note dot important, and it will target any paragraphs that have both class note and class important. So it'll combine those classes and look for both of them to exist. There's a few times where that will make sense to do. Questions on class selectors? Will show examples of these in a little bit. ID selector will select elements by their ID, and we use the pound sign. So pound introduction will target the element with that ID. Typically, you can combine these. You could do paragraph pound introduction, but typically we don't need to because that should only apply to one element, right? So usually just targeting that ID is enough. We don't have to combine it with other selectors. We may put other stuff after it. We'll talk about that. But that's how we would target something by their ID. Usually you're using this for like larger sections or something like that. Target your introduction section or your body section, stuff like that. So then the descendant selector. So we'll talk a lot about, kind of use this family language. So we'll talk about descendants and children and siblings and parents and stuff like that. So just think of your HTML structure and kind of think of where elements are in your structure. So I've got an example up here. This div here would be the parent element. And then we've got an H1, which is a child element of that div. We've got a parent or a P, which is also a child element of this div. These are also descendants, right? So, they're children, but also anything, if we've got another div and then inside that div is a P, that P is also a descendant of this div, right? It's not necessarily a direct child, it's a grandchild, if you want to continue that illustration, but it's still a descendant, right? So again, kind of think of this language, it kind of helps some of these different types of selectors make sense. So descendant selector will match any elements that are inside of another element at any level. So any sort of descendant all the way, it could be very deep inside that element, but it will be selected. So for example, we could do P space A. So we do a space to indicate a descendant. So we'll target any A element anywhere inside of any P element. So it'll look for any P, and then it'll look for any A inside of that P. And it'll target all of them. If there's multiple ones, it'll target all of them. So for example, here, if we did like div space P, we would target this div, and then here's a descendant P, and then also here's a descendant P inside of that div. So any elements inside of that element. So, for example, we can kind of combine these. We could do, pound introduction, space A to target any A's inside of an element with ID introduction. We could do like paragraph of class note, space M, to target any emphasized text inside of the paragraph with class note. Makes sense? I think I have, I'll show some more examples here in a second. So descendant, that's probably the most, common as far as, I use, this is kind of the go-to for selecting elements that are inside of other elements. You've got a section of introduction, you want all the links inside that to be blue. You can do that using that sort of targeting. And again, as we go along with these different types of selectors, usually there's multiple ways to select the elements that you want. We'll kind of talk a little bit about how to choose how to select them, but typically I want to use the simplest and most straightforward selector possible to choose the element I want. And again, it's kind of, you kind of just have to get used to how you want to do it. It kind of depends on what you want to style, how you select. So typically I start by just looking at my site and choosing, okay, I want these links here to be this color, or I want, all links that come right after a heading to be a certain color, something like that. And then you sort of figure out what selector you need to use. So all these selectors are just kind of tools in your toolbox, right? You may not use all of them, especially as we get to some of these more obscure ones. You may not use all of them. You kind of use what you need to achieve the styles that you want. So after descendant, we have a direct child selector. So this will match elements that are direct children of another. So with no other elements in between. So it doesn't select all descendants, it only selects direct children. So for example, we do this with the angle bracket or the greater than sign. So LI and then angle bracket A will target only A elements that are direct children of an LI. So it will not target A elements that are inside of an LA but are not direct children. So I actually run into this a lot if you have like a list and then sublists. So come over here a little bit. Say you have like a UL and you've got an LI, and then you've got like an A. You close your LI. And then say maybe you've got another LI. You've got another LI, but then inside of that LI, you've got an OL. So like a sublist LI, and then an A. You might use the direct child selector. Say this is like navigation or something, and this is like a submenu. You may only want your top level navigation links to be styled a certain way, and you want your sub ones to be a little bit smaller or something like that. So you might do, like a UL Or I guess LI would make more sense. You would do like LI, or yeah, you would, because you only want to target your top level. So you might do like UL, LI, A, something like that, to say direct children is my UL. So this LI will not be targeted because it's not a direct child of this UL, it's a grandchild, right? It's a direct child of this OL. So we're targeting only direct children with our LI, and then only A direct children of that LI. So this A would not be targeted, only this A. So I only want my top level links to be styled a certain way and not my sub. So again, another example, you've got an LI, you've got an A, then maybe you've got a paragraph inside that LI and a link inside the paragraph. And say you only want to target that first A, not the one inside the paragraph, you would use, if you just did LI space A, it targets both of these A's because it targets any A's inside of an LI anywhere. But LI angle bracket A will only target this first one that's a direct child. Make sense? This one I use some. Descendant typically is the most common, I usually don't care about, being this specific. Direct child selector I do use a good amount of the time. So again, here's another example. So if we, here we've got, a UL, here's the exact example I showed. We've got a UL, and then we've got a nested OL inside of list item 2, has its own sublist. So if we did UL space LI, it looks at this UL and says, okay, any LIs inside of this UL. So that one still inside it, and that one, and that one. But if we did UL angle bracket LI, only these are direct children. These are no longer direct children because they're inside another element. But this is a direct child because, again, it's, if you look at the structure of it, it's a direct child of that UL. It's not inside the UL. Questions? Yeah.
That OL would as well,
it would. It totally would, because it would see this UL, okay, here's a UL, LIs, okay, new UL, any direct children of that UL. So definitely would. Great question. Yeah.
Are other things going to have something great structure
No. No, that's more for your assignment. So, and the indentation again shows you the structure, but it doesn't really matter. If you move this LI way over here and didn't indent it, it doesn't change the fact that it won't be selected because it's still, inside this OL. And you can remove all the indentation and just put everything on one line. It still is the exact same. So the indentation more is just a visual reference. Good question though. Okay, a few more CSS selectors. These I don't use as often, but they're still kind of good to know about. I'm going to do these in the opposite order. First, the general sibling selector will match any element that's a sibling of another. So we use the tilde. So if you did H1 tilde, it'll target all P elements that are siblings of an H1 element. So looking at this example over here, we've got an H1, and then we've got a P. This P is a sibling of this H1 because it's not a child, it's not a grandchild, it's a sibling because it's on the same level structurally. This paragraph here is also a sibling of this H1, so again, it's still in the same level. They both have the same parent, so they're siblings, right? So we can use this kind of family language. Going back up here, adjacent sibling selector is a little bit more specific. It will only target the next sibling. So it will only target an adjacent sibling, something that's next to it. And we use the plus for that. This one I use even less than this one. If we do H1 plus P, it will only target the first P element after any H1 element. That's a sibling. So looking at our example here, our H1, this P is an adjacent sibling. This P is not an adjacent sibling. So H1 plus P would not select this paragraph because it's not right after our H1. So again, I've used this a few times. Say you've got headings and you have a paragraph after them. You only want to style that first paragraph after the heading. perfectly valid CSS selector to use for that. So yeah, here's that example. If we got a heading, we've got two paragraphs. We want our first paragraph to be styled a little bit differently. This first one will be targeted by H1 plus P and H1 tilde P, whereas the second one is only targeted by H1 tilde P. So that's a valid style choice. You've got to, and you see this sometimes with like, books, like the first line of the first paragraph of the chapter will be bigger, or the first letter will be bigger, something like that. So perfectly valid reasons to use these selectors. Again, you could achieve the same thing with a class. Like we could say, P class equals, first line or something like that and target it that way. But doing it this way kind of keeps it a little bit cleaner, keeps our HTML structure clean. Yeah, question.
Which selector would be identified priority? That was targeted by both
Yeah, great question. We'll talk about that in 1 second. It might actually be the next slide. Nope, we have an example, and then we'll talk about it. So yeah, again, adjacent sibling selector, if we do P plus P, it'll select a paragraph that's the adjacent sibling to that paragraph. So it won't select this third one because it's not adjacent. So if we have like a fourth one right after here, it would also select the fourth one because it kind of hits it, gets it, and then it sort of resets. So it'll find the next one and then look for any adjacents to that. If we did like div adjacent sibling P, you notice this first P is not selected because it's not a sibling to this div, it's a child to this div. But then here we've got a div and it does have an adjacent sibling P. Here we'd be using general sibling, so P general sibling P. Both of these are general siblings to this one. If we did the div, again, this is the child, not a sibling, but this one would match. Okay, so cascading. So getting your point about when multiple CSS rules apply to the same element. So there's a couple of different factors that play into which one is applied. So the first one is last rule. So if two selectors are identical, the latter of the two will take precedent. And this also applies to like general sibling or adjacent sibling. Those are kind of considered to be the same in this case. So if you have a general sibling and you have well, actually, adjacent sibling might take precedence over general sibling. I'm not sure off the top of my head which one technically is more specific. We'll get to that in a second. But if your selectors are identical, the latter of the two take place. It also is the case when you have multiple CSS files. So your browser renders your CSS in order as is in your HTML. So if you've got like 4 CSS files, it loads them in order and it runs through each file in order. It basically combines them all and then just goes down line by line. So if you've got a rule that overrides something, if it's later on in your file, that'll take precedence. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. So for identical selectors, just the last one will override any previous one. After that, if one selector is more specific than other selectors, it will take precedence. So the more specific rule takes precedence. And by the way, this is all called cascading. This is where the name cascading style sheets comes from, because we have different levels of specificity that we can apply, so it kind of cascades down. So for instance, if we do paragraph with ID of intro, that's really specific and a lot more specific than just saying paragraph. So targeting an ID is about the most specific you get because there should only be one of them, right? So it knows, okay, anything targeting that ID, I'll apply those rules with greater precedence. So in general, order from least to most specific is the type selector. So like your P or your div or your H1. That's the least specific selector you can have, followed by class, then followed by ID, and then actually followed by the style attribute. So if you do use the style equals in your HTML, that'll override any of your CSS. So that's one of the reasons we don't use it, because we can run into problems with our CSS. Another thing to point out, too, is that having multiple selectors also increases the specificity. So, you say paragraph, and then you say, div space paragraph. That div space paragraph is more specific than just saying paragraphs. because there's more, you know, identifiers. If you want to really dig into it, there's a link here that kind of goes through it. There's actually like a point value, so your browser actually like does a calculation to determine how specific your rule is. It's like, you know, it's something like, you know, type selectors are like 2 points, and class selectors are 10 points, and IDs are like 100. You know, so it like combined, it looks, okay, how many class selectors are there? Okay, each one's worth 2 points, then how many, you know, and if there's multiple rules that both apply to the same element, it will look at those values and figure out which one takes precedence. So you can get really specific if you want. Hopefully your CSS isn't complicated enough if you ever have to worry about that. Generally, just try and be more specific, and it should work out how you want. Sometimes for work, we've got probably like 10 CSS files and different frameworks, and our CSS files are thousands of lines long. It gets really complex. So every once in a while, I do have to think, okay, like what's the actual value of this, you know, specificity-wise, and really kind of dig into the details. But hopefully, we never have to deal with that in the scope of this class. So here's a, you know, example of specificity. So if we've got a paragraph with a class and an ID on it, if we just target the paragraph, that's great. But now we've overridden it with the intro class, and then we've overridden it with the ID class, which is the most specific. So the color of that would be black. And even if we reverse the order of these CSS rules, and we did the ID first, and then the class, and then the paragraph, it still would be black, because this one is the most specific. So it's going to take precedence no matter what the order is. Kind of a nuclear option that we have that I don't want to tell you about because you shouldn't use it unless you absolutely have to, but you will be glad I told you about it when you do need it, is the important flag. So this is a way that we basically tell our browser, should take precedence over any other rules targeting this element. So we apply it like this. We have, you know, our paragraph selector, color yellow, and then you do important before your semicolon. So again, you want to use this sparingly. It's always better to resolve your issues. There will be times when you're writing a CSS rule, I can't tell you how many times it happens to me, where you write some CSS rule, okay, I'll just move this over here. It doesn't happen. Okay, maybe I typed something wrong. No, looks fine. The selector's fine. Everything should be good. But it's not working, and it's because it's being overridden by some other rule. The first thing you want to do is just try and make your rule more specific. So if there's an ID you can throw in there to use, if you want to add another class, or just make it more specific so it'll take precedence. But if you can't seem to get it to work, you can throw the important flag on there, and it should override it. Again, we don't want to use this too much, because if everything has important on it, then you can't override stuff with important, because it's still used, like this adds like 1,000 or something like that to the specificity. So if you add, you know, important to 2 different rules that both take precedence, it just reverts to the normal rules. So like if, you know, your paragraph has important and your ID has importance, the ID one now is going to go into effect. So adding important to your paragraph does nothing, because the ID has important too. So it's still more important. So use very sparingly. You'll know when you need it. If you're trying and it works, okay, great. You can sometimes see in the, let me see if I can show you an example. You can sometimes see where the CSS is not applying certain rules. When you inspect element, I don't know if we're going to be able to see here. But like over here on, you know, like say we've got some paragraphs selected. If you're in your inspector, I'm going to close this. Here's an example. So you may not be able to see it because it's so low. So we've got this paragraph selected. You can see here the font family is Open Sans, and that's applied to the body. So they just said everything on the body tag, font family is Open Sans. But then you see down here, there's these crossed out rules. So on the HTML, they've said font family is sans serif. So they've replaced that. So this has been, you know, crossed out because it's been overridden by this one, because the body is more specific and probably came after it in the CSS rules. So you can tell, you know, if you add a CSS rule and it's not going into effect, open it up in an inspector and scroll to the bottom of your little styles thing over here and see if it shows up here but crossed out, because that means you have a specificity problem. You know, if we took this, you know, click this in inspector on the HTML and we said, you know, HTML, what is this, like Zen participation is the ID, and we said P and hit enter. Now you see it's no longer crossed out. We've made this rule a lot more specific. We've added an ID and, you know, this type selector. So now we see here font family of Open Sans is crossed out because that's no longer being applied. This one is being applied now. Didn't really change the look of it that much because Open Sans is a sans serif font. But so you can kind of play around with the inspector, and it's usually helpful in determining whether or not your styles are being overridden. Okay, inheritance. So some CSS properties will be inherited by their child elements. So the most important ones to be aware of are font family and color. So in that last example, they applied font family to the body. They didn't have to then also go and say P, font family, Open Sans, A, font family, Open Sans. That property gets inherited to all the child elements inside the body. So really convenient. Same goes for color. It'll get applied to any child elements inside of that element. Other properties like padding or border are not inherited by child elements. So you can have a div that has a border around it, you know, and you've got paragraphs inside it. Those paragraphs don't all then get their own border as well. You kind of have to look up by each property, you know, whether or not it's inherited. I had to look up sometimes, okay, does this property get inherited or not? You can also manually force any property to inherit a value from its parent by using the inherent value on a property. So say we set, you know, the padding of the body to 10 pixels, and then we've got a heading, we could say padding inherit, and then it will look at its parent to get that value. So there, I'll use that, you know, occasionally for different stuff that I want to force it to inherit to its child. Okay, CSS comments are a little bit different than HTML. So they're wrapped by a slash and a star, and then you do a star slash after it. Also different than most other programming languages. Again, if you're using, you know, a code editor, you can use like highlight and just command slash or whatever, and it'll take it for you, so you don't have to think about it too much. It is important to use comments in CSS, just like it is for HTML. So I like to add comments separating different sections of my CSS. So if I've got, you know, some CSS that's for my header, I'll put a comment and say this is header CSS, and then another section comment, this is body CSS. Something like that makes it a little easier to scroll through and find what you're looking for. It's good to leave, if you have to do something really weird, leave a note saying why you did that. I can tell you how many times I've been working on something, and a lot of the code that I work on is written by other people before me, and I'll be like, why on earth did they set margin -90 pixels here? It doesn't make any sense. They'll leave a comment saying, this on mobile, this displayed weird, so we moved this over, you know, stuff like that. Really kind of will be helpful for future developers. Okay, so let's talk about color. We've got a little bit of time. So there are two main color properties in CSS. The first one is foreground color, which is set by just the color property, and it will determine the color of our text. And then we've got background color, which determines the color of background. So, you know, for example, we might have like a div introduction where we say background color is black. Then we say div introduction space P. So all of our paragraphs inside that div, color is white. So we'll have white on black text. There's a couple of different color values we can use to indicate what color should be used. So the first is just the color name. We can just use the name color to indicate its value. These are kind of all generally agreed upon on browsers, so they're pretty safe to use. They may be slightly different in a few cases, but there's only 147 of them, which isn't that many really. So it's a pretty limited color palette. So we don't typically commonly use these, except they're great for examples because it's easier to say color red than some other examples. So like medium aquamarine is an example of a color that you can use. So I don't use these in real websites very often unless that color happens to match what I want, but typically you're going to want a little bit more precise than that. So RGB values express the red, green, and blue values of color as a number between 0 and 255. So you do use this parentheses, you do RGB parentheses, and then you provide the red, green, and blue values in that order. So again, it's just the level of red and green and blue. You're typically going to have to use some sort of color picker to choose those colors and modify them because we can't really imagine the different levels, so it's kind of hard to pick the exact color we want based on that. Hex codes are really common, so it's a little bit shorter way of expressing the same thing. So it represents the values for the red, green, and blue, but it's in hexadecimal encoded. So like 66 is hexadecimal for 102, CD is hexadecimal for 205, and it has the pound sign in front instead of the RGB. So that's probably the most common. Like if you look at most websites, they're probably using hexadecimal values. Really common. Most color pickers and Photoshop and stuff will give you the hexadecimal values of different colors. There's a few others. Another option is RGBA, which allows us to indicate an opacity value along with the RGB color. So the opacity value is known as alpha value, and it's just a number between 0 and 1. So 0 being fully transparent, so you won't see anything, and 1 being fully zero transparency. So it's a way to add some transparency to our color. It's important to keep in mind that it only affects the color. It doesn't affect like an image, stuff like that. So we could use this for text if you want your text to be a little bit transparent. You could use this for a background. If you've got like an image behind something and I'll use this sometimes if I've got like an image and then I want a div to have a background color, but the image to still come through. I'll do that, especially if I have an image that has like some weird lines or something that can kind of be distracting from the text. You could add that background color that's maybe 50.5, in the alpha value, so it's a little bit transparent. So it provides a little bit cleaner background for your text on top of your image, but it still lets the image come through a little bit. You can also just do like, white or black too if you didn't want it to be a color, but use the, transparency to kind of soften it a little bit. It's important to note, it's only supported by modern browsers. So especially if you need to keep in mind older browsers, it's good to include a backup color. I don't worry about this as much anymore for, if I'm building a new website and I know that there's not going to be too many older browsers using it, I don't worry about it. But if you're dealing with, for my job, I do have to worry about it because we have to support older browsers. So basically you do, again, the last rule applies. So you'll say color RGB and then color RGBA. So if the browser is old and I don't know what this RGB is or RGBA is, I'm going to ignore it. It at least has this RGB to fall back to that's already been set. So again, this is how you do the RGBA. You just got your red, green, and blue, and then you have your alpha value between 0 and 1. So CSS3 has added a new color property called HSL. That's actually my favorite. It's a little bit different. It's not as popular, but I think it makes a lot of sense if you can get used to it. So you indicate a color by its hue, saturation, and lightness. So if you use Photoshop much or done any photo editing, you're probably familiar with these terms. But hue is the color itself, indicated by an angle on the color wheel. So it's like 0 to 360 degrees, where 0 is red. I'll show an example of that in a second to kind of help you visualize. And then saturation is the amount of color versus gray. So like 0% saturation is just gray, whereas 100% saturation is full color, with no gray added, just the color. And then the lightness is the amount of white versus black. So 0% is fully black, and 100% will be fully white. So the lightness of the color. Show some examples. There's also HSLA, so you can add an opacity value as well. if you want to, again, where 0 is transparent, 1 is opaque. You should use a backup color if you're having to support older browsers. Again, for the purpose of this class, I wouldn't worry about indicating a backup color. But so I think HSL is a lot more intuitive, really, than hex and RGB. If I told you to give me the RGB values for blue, you know, well, okay, you can say blue 255, but it's really hard to kind of adjust. It's hard to imagine. If I said, okay, RGB 100, 100, 100, what color is that? You can't really picture it. It doesn't really make any sense. Even worse if I gave you hex. If I said, okay, hex 00 ACFD, what is that? You can't really figure it out unless you have them memorized. So HSL is a little bit easier to tell, especially if you can kind of picture the color wheel. At this point, I just kind of have it ingrained in my mind, so I kind of know which values go with which colors. It's also a lot easier to modify colors. You can create a lighter version of a color just by adjusting the brightness or the saturation. So this is why I love it. I'll pick a color for a website, like for my tasks. Put that color in HSL, and then say I want links to be a lighter version of that color. All I have to do is set the lightness, you know, an extra 20% or an extra, or I could drop the saturation to make it a little bit more of a gray version. So it lets you, I even have some, we'll talk about SAS, you know, a little bit later in the class. I have some functions that will generate versions of a color for me based on HSL. So I'll say, okay, here's a color, and then it'll generate like a muted version of the color. It'll generate a bright version of the color. It'll generate a dark version of the color. And then I'll apply those styles and say, okay, I want my main text to be the normal color. I want my links to be the muted color. I want my hover links to be the darker color, that kind of thing. So it's a lot easier to modify. Whereas with RGB, you don't know how to adjust RGB to get like a lighter version. So here's what the color wheel looks like. So again, 0 degrees is red and it goes counterclockwise. You know, so, you know, say HSL 240, that's going to be blue. And then again, once you kind of, I print this out and put it on my desk. But, you know, say you want, okay, that blue is nice. I want a little bit more of a purple blue. Just, you know, add 10 or 20 to your degree number and make it 260. And now you're kind of over in here. It's a little bit more of a purple blue. You know, same with red. If you want it to go more orange, just add a little bit to your number and kind of adjust the hue. So it's a lot easier to kind of make those adjustments than it is trying to guess what the RGB adjustments are. And this is kind of how lightness and saturation works. So lightness, 0 being pure black and 1, whereas 50% lightness is going to be just the color. Same goes with saturation, where 1 is full color, 0 is just gray. So another reason I like HSL is it's a lot easier to do different gradients of gray. So it doesn't really matter what the hue is. You know, I could say HSL, you know, 0 because it doesn't matter. I can do 0 on the lightness, or I can do 1 on the lightness and adjust the saturation to kind of make different versions of gray. Kind of makes it a little bit easier to make it lighter or darker. So again, here's some examples about HSL 0 being red, 100% on the saturation, so it's pure color. 50%, this is kind of, if you just want the pure color, you do 150. But say we want to make it darker, or sorry, we want to make it less saturated. We want less red, a little bit more muted red. We can just dial down the saturation to 50%, and now we've got, you know, a muted red. It's a little bit more gray. Or instead of that, you know, saturation is still 100, but we say we want it darker, we can dial the lightness down to 20%, which creates a darker version. Here's an example using the HSLA. So 1 in this case being fully opaque, but we could do something transparent. Okay, that's HSL. I like to advocate for it because I like it. I want it to catch on. So choosing colors. Colors are obviously subjective. It kind of depends on your design, what kind of colors you want to use. But one really important thing is the contrast. So contrast is really important when choosing the colors, especially for your text. You want to make sure there's enough contrast that's easily readable. If your contrast is too low, like this text here, it's kind of hard to read. It's even part of the accessibility guidelines and even part of the ADA requirements for accessibility to maintain a high net contrast ratio. Because some parts of visual impairments, they, you know, aren't totally blind, but they may have trouble, you know, different, you know, levels of that. So maintaining an appropriate contrast ratio really helps make sure it's readable. So just as a rule of thumb, if I'm doing, dark text on a light background, I use 555 for the text and FA for the background, which is what this, slide uses. Part of the accessibility guidelines are not to have too high of a contrast ratio, because if you have too high of a contrast ratio, it's fatiguing on the eyes. If you have pure white and pure black, it gets tiring to look at, especially on a screen that's just kind of throwing, light in your eyes. If it's just pure white light all day, it gets fatiguing to the eyes. So I really like to dial it down just a little bit. So you don't want too much contrast, but you don't want it too little either. So there's you can read through the guidelines if you want. It's kind of helpful. There's also some cool tools that help you gauge contrast. I'll show you an example of this here in a second. You can put in your background color and your foreground color, and it'll tell you what the ratio is and tell you if it's approved or not. A couple of options for choosing colors. I like colorpicker.com, or Adobe has a color wheel website that lets you kind of choose your colors, and it'll generate color palettes for you. We'll talk about that more. Coolers.co is kind of cool. It lets you generate color patterns and stuff. Or Photoshop or Pixlr or something usually has a color picker as well. I also use on my Mac Classic Color Meter. There's a couple different color programs like this, where as you hover over colors, it'll give you the RGB values, which is kind of nice if you're trying to match something from an image or steal a color from a website or something like that. So I like that a lot. I think it's there's a shortcut that copies the RGB value as hex or something like that. You can even have it give you as HSL. So it gives you, the HSL values of that color, or the hex or whatever you want. So it's pretty nice. I'll show you this contrast ratio tool because I really like it. It's just contrastratio.com now. So it lets you put in a background color and a text color. So for example, here we just have kind of a dark, kind of a transparent, and then it gives you the color. So if we just change this to black, we've got 21, ratio score. So that's a little extreme. It's still green. It's good. You see this AAA level. That's the ADA has different levels of what will pass. If we did white and gray, it shows you what that gray color is. Our score is a lot lower. It does pass as AA for large text, so it's above 18 point or bold above 14 point, then it passes. So again, big enough text, that's acceptable, but for most text, it's not going to be acceptable. Please never do something like blue and then green. Really bad contrast. Typically, you don't want two different colors on your foreground and your background. We'll talk about that more when we get into design principles. But some of the worst designs use pink as the background and purple as the foreground, or vice versa. It's hard to read. It's jarring to the eye. You can see here, it's just it hurts your eyes to look at. And you try and read this, and it just kind of doesn't work, right? And it's because there's not enough contrast. There's more. It's just it doesn't really work out. So same like red on black is really bad. If you text color red, it's a 2.14 fails. You're not allowed to use that. It's not accessible. As you look at you can't read it. It just doesn't. It's not readable. It's a little better on an actual screen than on a projector. But so a great tool. When you're choosing your colors, run it through that tool. Just make sure you got a high enough score. It should be green, and you're good. I'm not going to take points off. Even if the colors aren't pretty, it's at least going to be legible.